Hey there. Tonight, I want to tell you about a boy who was left out of the room when a prophet came looking for a king. And that small, forgotten detail tells you almost everything about the beginning of his story. Before the songs, before the giant, before the crown, before the failures that would darken the edges of his life, David was simply the youngest son in Bethlehem, out in the fields with the sheep, while everyone else stood where important people could see them. And yet this is why his story still lingers in the mind. He was not remembered because he looked perfect. He was remembered because through triumph and shame, through courage and tears, his heart kept turning back toward God. So settle in close for that thought tonight. The answer does not begin in a palace. It begins in dust, in grass, in the patient breathing of animals beneath the pale morning sky. And if you enjoy these quiet stories in the dark, do take a second to like the video and subscribe. It helps the fire stay lit around here, and it means a lot. Now, let the room soften a little. Let your shoulders ease down. Let the day stand a little farther away from you. We are going back to Bethlehem now, where the future of a kingdom looked very much like a boy trying to guide a stubborn sheep away from a thorn bush. Bethlehem did not glow with grandeur. It was a hill town of stone, weather, lavor, and waiting. The houses held the warmth of the day and gave it back slowly at night. Paths wound through dry ground packed hard by sandals, hooves, and years of repetition. Olive trees stood patient on the slopes, their leaves turning silver in the changing light. The mornings could be cool enough to wake the skin, and then by noon the air would thicken with sun and dust. Water had to be drawn, grain had to be ground, bread had to be kneaded, roofs had to be mended, and animals had to be watched, because animals, as I have always found, are very gifted at creating one new problem before you have finished solving the last one. In the middle of that ordinary life was the household of Jesse. He was no king. No herald ran before him. No one outside his town would have guessed that his family line was about to bend the shape of Israel's history. Inside his home were sons old enough to stand with the confidence that people notice. Strong sons, visibles sont, sons who looked the part when measured by human eyes. And then there was David, the youngest, out where the work was rougher and quieter. He spent his days with the flock. That sounds peaceful when said quickly, but the truth is, a shepherd's life was a school of patience, discomfort, vigilance, and small acts of care. Sheep do not move like disciplined soldiers. They drift. They hesitate. They wander toward things that will hurt them and away from the things that would keep them alive. A shepherd had to watch constantly, not in a dramatic way, but in a steady way, which may be harder. He had to know the weak one from the stubborn one, the one that lagged from the one that bolted, the safe path from the dangerous one. He had to listen for rustling in the dark and notice when the silence itself felt wrong. This is where David's heart was being trained. Not just his courage, though that too. Not just his endurance, though there was plenty of that. His heart, a person alone under wide skies, has a way of becoming honest with himself. There is not much room for pretending out there. Only wind, distance, and time. He learned to care for living creatures that could offer him no applause. He learned to protect what had been placed in his hands. He learned to stay alert while the world around him seemed half asleep. He learned to sing and play music in lonely hours. He learned to speak to God when no one else was listening. I think that matters more than people realize. Before David was ever praised by crowds, he was shaped in hidden places. Before he stood before a giant, he stood through long, quiet days that no one would have called heroic. Before he wore royal colors, his clothes smelled of field grass, wool, and the open air. It is hard for us to admire preparation when it looks so ordinary. But this is how many great stories begin. Quietly, almost invisibly. Then, one day, into that ordinary town came the prophet Samuel. He did not arrive with noise. The moment carried weight because of what it concealed. Samuel had been sent by the Lord on a mission that was both sacred and dangerous. Saul was still king in Israel, but God had rejected him. A new king would be chosen, and that new king would come from Jesse's house. You can imagine the tension that entered the household. A prophet at the door was not a small thing. People would have straightened their garments, lowered their voices, and watched every movement. Jesse brought his sons before Samuel one by one. The older brothers stepped forward, and from a human point of view, the scene must have looked almost settled already. Surely it would be one of them. Surely the future king would look the way people expect a king to look. But that is one of the great currents running through David's whole life. Human beings keep judging by appearance. God keeps looking deeper. Samuel saw Eliab, the eldest, and for a moment even he thought the answer had to be yes. But the Lord corrected him. Do not consider his appearance or his height. The Lord does not see as man sees. People look at outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Those words hang over the whole story like lamplight over a table. They explain the anointing. They explain the giant. They explain the kingship. They even explain the mercy that follows David later, after his sins. The Lord looks at the heart. So one brother passes, then another, then another. Still no. The room must have grown stranger with each refusal. Confidence thinning. Certainty fading. Jesse likely began to feel the awkwardness of it. Samuel was certain he had been sent here, and yet none of the sons standing before him had been chosen. Then came the question that turned the moment inside out. Are these all your sons? And Jesse answered that there was still the youngest, but he was out keeping the sheep. There is something almost painfully revealing in that line. Not cruel, perhaps, just telling. The youngest was not considered important enough to bring in from the field for this occasion. The family had gathered without him. The prophet had inspected the household without him. David was absent because no one expected him to matter in this particular way. He was useful, yes. Necessary, yes. But not central, not the obvious one. So Samuel said that they would not sit down until he was brought in. Somewhere under the open sky, a message reached David. Leave the flock. Come home. The prophet is waiting. Try to feel how unusual that must have sounded. The prophet is waiting for you. A sentence like that can alter the weight of the air around a person. David would have started back down the path with dust on his feet and sunlight in his eyes, perhaps wiping his hands on his tunic, perhaps still not knowing why he had been summoned. Behind him the sheep remained, with their grazing and drifting, perfectly uninterested in destiny, which is almost funny when you think about it. History is about to turn, and the sheep would still be sheep. When David entered, Samuel saw him not as a family saw its youngest, not as brothers saw their little brother, not as a village saw a shepherd, but as God saw a heart. The text mentions his appearance, but the deeper point is that the outward detail was not the deciding factor. The Lord said, "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." Then came the oil. That moment should move slowly in the mind. The horn is lifted. The oil catches the light. Its scent rises warm and rich in the room. It is poured onto the head of a boy who came in from the fields. In the presence of his brothers, David is anointed. No crown, no throne, no cheering crowd. Only a sacred act, a hidden future, and the presence of God settling over a life that looked ordinary a few moments before. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David from that day forward. That sentence is quiet, but it changes everything. The story of David is not really the story of a talented village boy who happened to rise. It is the story of a life marked by divine attention. That does not make his path easy. It does not make him flawless, but it does explain the strange durability of his heart. He will fail, deeply at times. He will grieve. He will wander through power and sorrow and terrible consequences. Yet he will not become indifferent to God. That is the pulse underneath the whole tale. And then, perhaps most surprisingly of all, he goes back to the sheep. This is one of the loveliest details in the early story because it is so unspectacular. The future king returns to the field. The chosen one goes back to ordinary work. If you were hoping for an immediate parade, you would be disappointed. If you were hoping for royal robes by sunset, no such luck. There are still sheep to gather, paths to walk, dusk to meet, cold to endure, and songs to sing under a sky slowly filling with stars. That return tells us something important about the kind of heart David had. He was not anointed into instant self-importance. He did not stride back into Bethlehem, demanding a better seat at the table. He went back to what had been given to him. He kept tending what was in front of him. The hidden call of God did not make him useless in the small tasks. It made those small tasks part of his training. So picture him that evening. The sun lowering over the hills. The flock bunching close in the cooling air. The day releasing its heat from the stones. David sits for a while, perhaps with his harp, perhaps with his thoughts, perhaps touching the place where the oil had run earlier. The world around him looks the same. The hills have not changed shape. The sheep have not suddenly grown wiser. Bethlehem remains small, rough-edged, and quiet, yet inwardly nothing is the same. A strange knowledge now lives in him. He has been chosen, though no throne is in sight. He has been seen, though most of the world still does not know his name. He has been marked by God, though tomorrow may look very much like today. You know that feeling when something has changed inside you, and yet the outside world keeps moving as if nothing happened. That is where David is now. In the stillness after calling. In the long beginning. And while he waits in the fields, beyond the range of his sight, another movement is beginning. In Saul's court, darkness is settling. Restlessness is growing around the throne. Soon the shepherd's music will be called into a king's troubled house. Soon the hidden heart in Bethlehem will be brought near power, near danger, and near the first great turning in his astonishing life. The next movement in David's story begins not with battle, but with a troubled room. Saul was still king, and outwardly the kingdom remained under his rule. The throne was occupied. The court still functioned. Orders still moved through servants and soldiers. Yet something had gone wrong at the center. The Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and he was tormented. The old calm was gone. The story describes a darkness settling over him, a disturbance that no one around him seemed able to mend. However, one chooses to describe that experience. Spiritually, emotionally, or both, the effect is clear. Saul was restless, difficult to soothe. And when a king's mind is troubled, the unease spreads outward through every hall and doorway. I imagine the palace carrying that tension like a low storm. Servants move carefully. Conversations shorten when footsteps approach. Hands become a little clumsier because everyone is listening for mood before they are listening for words. Lamps burn in the evening, their small flames reflected in polished surfaces, while behind carved doors, the ruler of Israel wrestles with something none of his power can command into silence. It is a strange thing, really. We spend so much time imagining power as a kind of protection, but again and again, the old stories tell us that the soul is not impressed by rank. A crown cannot force peace to stay. A throne cannot order the mind into stillness. Saul had authority, weapons, attendants, and a palace around him, and yet relief seemed to slip through his fingers like water. Then someone in his service offered a practical answer. Find a musician. Bring in a man who can play skillfully on the harp. Let music do what force cannot do. It is such a human solution, and perhaps that is why it feels so true. When the mind is agitated, argument often only tightens the knot. Music can move softly around the edges. It can pass through a room without demanding anything. It can settle where commands fail. One of Saul's servants knew of a young man in Bethlehem. His description of David is wonderfully layered. He says the young man can play well. Yes, but that is not all. He is brave. He is a warrior in promise, even if not yet in public fame. He speaks with good sense. He is pleasing in appearance. Most importantly, the Lord is with him. That last phrase matters more than all the others. It is the true center. David's skill is real. His courage is real. But what makes his story more than impressive is the presence of God with him. So, word goes out, and David is summoned from the hills. That journey into Saul's court must have felt like stepping from one world into another. In Bethlehem, he knew the rhythm of flocks, weather, and open land. He knew the feel of a staff in his hand, the tug of a lamb resisting direction, the wide silence of evenings under the stars. The field had honest difficulties. A storm was a storm. A predator was a predator. Hunger, cold, and fatigue declared themselves plainly. But a palace teaches another kind of complexity. There people can smile and conceal. They can praise and resent in the same breath. Danger may wear perfume and polished bronze. David entered that place, still carrying the shape of the outside world in him. Perhaps he smelled faintly of cedar wood and the clean, rough scent of wool. Perhaps the marks of the field were still on his hands even after washing. He did not come as a prince. He came as a servant with an instrument. And then the first notes were played. Let that scene breathe for a moment. A dim chamber, firelight shifting on the walls. A king in distress. Servants keeping their distance while pretending not to watch too closely. David settles the harp against himself and draws music from it with careful hands. No fanfare. No performance meant to dazzle the court. The purpose is gentler than that. He is there to ease a troubled spirit. The sound would have entered the room like a stream entering dry ground. One note, then another. Clear, patient, unhurried. The kind of music that does not push. It surrounds. It gives the air a different shape. Saul's breathing slows. The tension in the room softens. Harsh thoughts recede for a while, not defeated forever, but held back. There is relief, and everyone near enough to witness it would have felt the change. It is worth pausing here because the tenderness of this detail is easy to miss. Before David is known as the slayer of Goliath, he is known as the one who brought comfort to a suffering king. Before he becomes a public hero, he serves quietly in a private sorrow. That is a beautiful beginning. And it says something essential about why he is remembered as a man after God's own heart. His story is not only made of strength, it is also made of responsiveness. He brings what is needed. He plays where there is pain. He serves before he is celebrated. Saul grows fond of him. David remains in his service. In time, he even becomes armor-bearer to the king, which is one of those small developments that seems practical on the surface and deeply significant underneath. The shepherd boy who once carried a staff now stands close to royal weapons. The musician who came to play in a troubled room now moves near military power. His life is opening in more than one direction at once. I think David must have learned a great deal in silence during those days. He would have watched how orders were given, how messages arrived, how men of rank behaved when they were confident and when they were afraid. He would have learned the feel of court life, the pace of official business, the thin edge between honor and tension. Out in the fields, he had learned to guide sheep. In the palace, he began learning how men move around power, which is often much less graceful than sheep, though perhaps no less predictable if you watch long enough. And still he remained himself. The source does not present him as dazzled by status. There is no sense that he forgot the field or became swollen with self-importance. Instead, he seems useful, present, and attentive. That steadiness matters. The hidden anointing in Bethlehem had not made him proud. It had made him ready. There is also a quiet sadness in these palace scenes when we read them knowing what lies ahead. David is serving the very man who will later fear him. He is easing the mind of the king who will one day hurl a spear at him. The relationship begins in relief and trust, not in rivalry. Saul needs help, and David helps him. That makes the coming fracture feel all the more tragic. Some of the saddest stories begin with kindness. At times, when the music had done its work and the room had settled, David may have found himself alone with his thoughts in some corner of the royal house. Perhaps he looked out through a narrow opening toward the darkening land and thought of Bethlehem. The contrast would have been impossible to miss. In the hills the night spread wide and clean. In the palace it gathered in enclosed rooms, heavy with politics, memory, and listening servants. In the fields, silence belonged to the earth and the stars. In the court, silence belonged to tension. Yet God was present in both places. The same Lord who had seen him among the sheep was with him here in the house of a troubled king. That truth may explain much of David's composure. He did not need to become another person to enter the court. He did not need to abandon the heart formed in secret places. He carried that heart with him. He carried the field into the palace. In ascensa, its patience, its watchfulness, its music, its habit of prayer. And the palace needed exactly that. A servant had called him skillful, brave, sensible, and favored by God. At first glance, that description may sound almost too polished, but as the story unfolds, it feels less like flattery and more like a quiet recognition of a life already taking shape. David is not yet publicly famous, but hints of his future can already be seen in the way he serves. He calms without shrinking. He observes without boasting. He stands near suffering without recoiling from it. That is not a small thing. Honestly, I have always found it remarkable that one of the first great public functions of David's life is simply to be a steady presence in another man's storm. We tend to remember the louder scenes, the battlefield, the giant, the songs afterward. But before all that, there was this: a young man with a harp in a room full of unease, offering peace where he could. There is something deeply human in it, and deeply holy, too. Meanwhile, the larger world was moving toward crisis. Beyond the palace walls, Israel's old struggle with the Philistines had not vanished. Armies still gathered when called. Scouts still watched borders. The air over the kingdom held that familiar sense that conflict could break open at any time. David, now positioned near Saul, stood quietly at the edge of events larger than himself. He could not yet know how soon his own name would spread through the land. For now he remained the musician, the armor-bearer, the shepherd brought near the throne. This in-between season is important. Great changes are often prepared in narrow rooms long before they are revealed in public. David is learning the court before he faces the battlefield. He is learning the instability of a king before he learns the adoration of the crowd. He is learning how quickly peace can disappear from a powerful man. All of this will matter later. All of it is training. even if no one around him fully understands it. I can almost hear the rhythm of those days, the soft footfalls of servants in the early morning, the clink of armor being checked, the low murmur of messages exchanged in hallways. Then at some troubled hour, the summons for David. Bring the harp. The king is not well. And David goes. Again and again he goes. He steps into the room. He plays. The air changes. Rest comes for a time. If you were there with me, seated somewhere just beyond the firelight, I think you would notice how much of David's story depends on this willingness to answer what is needed in the moment. He does not demand a stage. He does not force a future. He serves the day he has been given. That is one of the reasons his life, for all its flaws, keeps bending back toward God. A heart after God is not a perfect heart. It is a responsive one. It can be called, corrected, humbled, and still return. Soon the quiet service of the court will give way to something louder. A valley will open. A giant voice will roll across the ranks of Israel. Fear will seize men who should have stood firm. And the same young man who soothed a king's darkness with music will walk into that public terror carrying only what his earlier life had placed in his hands. But for now the chamber remains dim. The harp strings settle. The king's breathing steadies. And the shepherd from Bethlehem waits in the strange stillness before his name is known by everyone. The next great turning in David's life begins with a valley full of fear. War had drawn Israel and the Philistines into a long, hard stare across the land. Two armies faced one another, with the space between them holding more than dust and distance. It held dread, delay, and the slow draining of courage. Morning after morning the lines formed. Morning after morning men took their places. Spears caught the light. Armor warmed under the sun. Voices rose, then thinned, then faded into waiting. It is remarkable how exhausting fear can be, even when nothing yet happens. Sometimes especially when nothing happens. Out from the Philistine side came the figure that seemed to gather all that fear into one body. Goliath of Gath, a champion, a towering warrior wrapped in bronze, heavy with armor, carrying the confidence of a man who had spent a long time believing no one could stand before him. The details matter because the point is not merely that he was large. It is that he looked impossible. Everything about him was meant to overwhelm the eye before battle even began. Height, metal, movement, voice, all of it pressed upon the imagination. And then came the challenge. Send out a man to fight me. 1 against 1. Let the battle be settled in a single contest. Day after day he came. And day after day, Israel listened. 40 days of hearing the same threat, the same mockery, the same humiliation poured over them like hot wind. It is hard to keep your soul steady when terror repeats itself with such confidence. Even brave men can begin to feel smaller after enough mornings like that. The whole army stood there, carrying the weight of public fear. David was not on the battlefield as a soldier when this moment found him. He came, as he often came, from one world into another. Through an ordinary task. His father sent him with food for his brothers, bread and grain and care carried into a place of iron and tension. That detail feels important. He arrives, not seeking a stage, but serving his family. Again and again, David's story moves that way. Service first, revelation later. So picture him approaching the camp. The smell changes before the sight does. Sweat, leather, metal warmed by sun, the dry scent of trampled ground. Men moving in clusters, animals tethered nearby. Voices carrying fragments of rumor and frustration. David passes through it carrying supplies, asking after his brothers, hearing the unease in every answer before anyone explains it plainly. Then Goliath appears again. The giant steps forward as if the valley belongs to him. His voice rolls across the space between the armies. He speaks with the sort of contempt that expects no interruption. He is not only challenging men, he is insulting Israel's God, mocking the armies of the living God as though heaven itself were absent from the field. And David hears it. That is the spark. Others had heard the same words for many days and felt fear. David hears them and feels outrage. Not the wild kind, not the foolish kind, but the clean indignation of someone whose measure of the moment is not being set by the size of the enemy. He cannot understand why this defiance is being tolerated. Who is this Philistine, he asks, that he should speak this way against the armies of the living God? There is something almost disarming in his reaction. He does not begin by measuring Goliath's height. He does not begin by listing the giant's weapons. He begins with God. That is one of the clearest reasons David is remembered as a man after God's own heart. His instinct is to locate the true center of the situation. Everyone else is staring at the giant. David is staring through the giant toward the dishonor being done to God. His brothers do not appreciate this at all. Eliab hears him speaking and reacts with anger, accusing him of pride and curiosity, as though David had only come to watch the spectacle. It is one of those painfully human scenes. A family can stand very near a calling and still misread the person carrying it. David, who had once been forgotten in the field, is now dismissed again in the camp. Yet he does not let the misunderstanding silence him. He keeps asking questions. He keeps pressing into the moment. Soon his words reach Saul. So David is brought before the king, and once more the shepherd from Bethlehem stands in a room where power and fear are already present before he speaks. Saul sees only the obvious problem. "You are young," he tells David, "and Goliath has been a warrior from his youth." By all visible standards, that is a sensible objection. One cannot accuse Saul of poor arithmetic here. Giant plus armor plus combat experience does indeed look like a very bad equation for a shepherd boy. But David's answer comes from another kind of memory. He speaks of the sheep. He tells Saul that while tending his father's flock, he had faced lions and bears, striking them down when they carried off lambs. It is a vivid little thread tying the field to the battlefield. Nothing from those quiet years has been wasted. The hidden courage learned among the animals is now being carried into public danger. David does not say that he is naturally fearless. He says that the Lord who delivered him before will deliver him again. That is the center of his confidence. The field had taught him to protect what was entrusted to him. Now the honor of God and the fear of Israel stand before him like another flock under threat. His logic is simple in the deepest sense. God was faithful there. God will be faithful here. Saul, perhaps with more desperation than conviction, allows it. He even tries to dress David in royal armor. And here, the story gives us one of its finest moments of clarity. David puts on the armor, tries to move in it, and realizes it is not his. It does not fit the life God has trained him in. So he takes it off. I have always loved that scene. There is wisdom in knowing what you cannot carry, and there is wisdom in refusing borrowed strength when God has already given you your own tools. A less steady heart might have felt ashamed to appear small. David does not seem interested in appearing larger than he is. He is interested in being faithful. So he goes down to the brook. The battle has not begun yet, and still, the moment feels sacred. Water moves over smooth stones with patient sound. David bends and chooses 5 smooth stones from the stream, placing them in his pouch one by one. There is no hurry in the telling, and I do not think there should be. His fingers know what they are touching. This is not random. This is the work of a shepherd who has used a sling before, who understands the weight and shape that belong in his hand. The valley waits. Armies watch. The giant breathes threats into the air, and David is kneeling by the water choosing stones. You know that feeling when everyone expects drama and the truly important thing turns out to be a quiet act of preparation. That is this moment. Water, stone, and faith. Then he walks forward. The contrast could hardly be sharper. On one side, Cise, armor, spectacle, all the theater of earthly power. On the other, a young man with a staff, a sling, a pouch, and a confidence that seems either holy or ridiculous, depending on whether one is looking with faith. Goliath certainly thinks it is ridiculous. He sees David and mocks him. "Am I a dog," he says in effect, "that you come at me with sticks?" He curses. He threatens. He promises to leave David's body to the birds and beasts. And David answers. His words matter as much as the stone that follows. You come to me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Again he places the battle in its true frame. This is not David displaying bravery for its own sake. This is David standing where the honor of God is at stake. The valley narrows into a single moment. David runs toward the battle line. His hand goes into the bag. A stone is set in the sling. The motion is practiced, fluid, almost plain in its simplicity. No wasted movement. No trembling pause. The sling spins. The stone flies. Then the impossible thing happens with almost startling swiftness. It strikes Goliath in the forehead, and the giant falls forward into the dust. The story is so famous that it can lose some of its strangeness through repetition. But if you sit with it, it is astonishing. The long days of fear end in a breath. The warrior who had seemed too large to challenge is suddenly lying still on the earth. The taunting voice is gone. The giant has fallen, and all the calculations built on visible power collapse with him. Israel surges forward. The Philistines break. Victory moves through the valley like released breath. But the deeper victory is not military alone. It is spiritual. In one sharp, bright moment, God has shown again that He is not limited by the scales that terrify human beings. The Lord does not see as man sees. The line first spoken in Jesse's house now echoes through the battlefield. David becomes a hero almost at once. His name moves from mouth to mouth. The shepherd is now the giant slayer. The one overlooked at home is suddenly known across the nation. Songs will follow. Admiration will follow. Envy will follow too, though that shadow has not fully crossed the story yet, for now the air is still full of the aftermath of wonder. And if we ask again why David is remembered as a man after God's own heart, this day answers clearly. It was not because he was the strongest man in the valley. He was not. It was not because he was untouched by fear as a matter of temperament. The story does not say that either. It was because, when everyone else saw an impossible enemy, David still arranged the world around God first. He trusted that the Lord was present. He acted from that trust. His heart leaned toward God before it leaned toward safety. That is what gave courage its shape. And as the dust settles over the fallen giant, another thread begins to tighten quietly in the royal house. Victory has lifted David into the sight of the nation. Soon one heart will love him deeply, and another will begin to fear him with the sort of fear that turns admiration into danger. After the valley, David's life changed in the way lives sometimes do after one decisive act. He was no longer only the shepherd from Bethlehem, or the quiet musician who could calm a troubled king. He was now the young man who had stepped into Israel's fear and broken it. The story moved him into public light very quickly after that, and public light has a way of warming some hearts while darkening others. One of the first hearts drawn close to David was Jonathan's. Their friendship begins with unusual force, almost as if the story wants us to understand at once that this bond is not casual. Jonathan, son of Saul, heir to the throne, sees David and loves him as his own soul. That language is tender, solemn, and rare. It suggests recognition deeper than convenience, deeper than politics, deeper even than shared success in battle. Jonathan sees something in David that his father cannot receive without fear. He sees worth without needing to compete with it. I have always found Jonathan one of the loveliest presences in this whole story. He could have viewed David as a threat. In purely human terms, perhaps he should have. The people are beginning to notice David. The air around him is changing. And Jonathan, of all people, has the most to lose if David's star continues rising. Yet jealousy does not grow in him. Love does. That itself is a kind of quiet nobility. Then comes the gesture that makes the friendship almost ceremonial. Jonathan takes off the robe he is wearing and gives it to David, along with his tunic, his sword, his bow, and his belt. It is more than generosity. It carries the feeling of recognition, almost surrender. The prince's robe falls into the shepherd's hands. The royal son honors the one whom God has chosen. It is an intimate and symbolic act, warm with affection and heavy with meaning. Picture the scene slowly. Fabric gathered in Jonathan's hands. The transfer of garments. The touch of leather. The weight of weapons. No grand speech is needed. Sometimes the deepest truths are spoken in what one gives up without resentment. Jonathan is not diminished by this. He becomes more beautiful in it. David continues to serve with success. Whatever Saul sends him to do, he does wisely. He leads men in battle and returns with victory. Officers respect him. Soldiers trust him. The people take to him naturally. It is one of those rises that feels both sudden and prepared, because the public is only now seeing what the hidden years had already formed. Then the songs begin. After a victory, the women come out from the towns to celebrate. There is music, movement, the bright public joy that follows survival and triumph. They sing that Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. On the surface, it is celebration. In Saul's heart, it becomes a wound. That is the beginning of the next darkness. There is something so painfully human in it. Saul hears praise, even praise that still honors him, and cannot rest in it because another name has been lifted higher beside his own. Envy often begins that way, not with hatred, but with comparison. A person hears his place measured against someone else, and suddenly nothing good tastes as it should. The song enters Saul and does not leave. It repeats in him. Thousands, tens of thousands. Thousands, tens of thousands. Little words can become sharp things when pride keeps turning them over. From that time on, Saul watches David with suspicion. The change may not have been visible all at once, but it was real. What had once pleased him now unsettled him. The young musician who had soothed his distress becomes the young warrior whose success threatens his peace. Saul begins to fear David because the Lord is with him, and because the people love him. Fear and envy make a poor mixture in any soul. In a king, they become especially dangerous. Then comes the spear. The scene unfolds in a room that should feel familiar by now. Saul is troubled again. David is playing as he had played before. The harp is sounding in the same service it always had, soft and faithful in a darkened chamber. Yet this time, Saul is holding a spear. That detail sits in the room like a crack running through stone. David plays. Saul brots. The music that once brought calm now moves through an atmosphere crowded with suspicion. Then, suddenly, Saul hurls the spear, hoping to pin David to the wall. It misses. David escapes, and the fact that it happens twice only deepens the strangeness of the moment. The man who had once been relief in Saul's suffering is now a target in Saul's rage. The court must have felt different after that, colder, less certain, full of the kind of silence that follows an act no one can pretend not to understand. And still, David continues to prosper. That must have troubled Saul all the more. Every success sharpened his fear. Every victory made David more visible. Every sign of favor, military, public, or spiritual, fed the king's sense that the kingdom was slipping toward another man. Saul cannot bring himself to trust what God is doing, so he schemes against it. One of those schemes takes shape through his daughter Michal. She loves David, and when Saul learns of it, he sees not romance, but opportunity. He offers her in marriage, imagining the arrangement can be turned into a trap. The bride price he demands is dangerous, designed to place David in the path of death. Saul hopes the Philistines will solve his problem for him. It is a chilling little twist. Even affection inside the royal house becomes something he tries to weaponize. But David survives. More than survives. He returns having done even more than was required. The plan fails. Michal becomes his wife. Saul sees again that his efforts to destroy David keep folding back into David's rising honor. At some point, envy becomes exhausting even to the one who carries it. But Saul does not seem able to put it down. Jonathan, meanwhile, remains constant. This matters deeply. In a house divided by fear, Jonathan stands as loyalty without calculation. He speaks well of David to Saul. He reminds his father that David has not wronged him, that he risked his life against the Philistine and brought victory to Israel. For a moment, Saul listens. For a moment, he swears that David will not be put to death. You can almost feel the fragile hope in that pause, as though peace might still be possible if only reason could hold. But it does not hold. The darkness returns. Saul's agitation flares again. Another spear is thrown. Another escape follows. The pattern is set now. David is no longer merely serving in danger. He is living under it. At this point, Michal becomes more than a daughter of Saul. She becomes the one who helps David survive. When the king's men come to watch David's house and kill him in the morning, Michal sees the danger clearly. She warns David. If he does not run that night, he will be dead by the next day. There is tenderness and urgency in what follows. A house gone quiet. The pressure of time. Perhaps the sound of men outside. Perhaps only the knowledge that they are there. Michal helps David climb down through a window and escape into the night. Slow that moment down. The room behind him is the last shelter he can trust in Saul's world. The opening before him is dark. Stone outside holds the night's coolness. Fabric shifts softly as he lowers himself. A hand releases another hand. The future king, the giant slayer, the beloved friend of Jonathan, slips away not in triumph but in secrecy, under cover of darkness, because the king he served has decided he must die. There is something almost unbearably sad in that image. David entered Saul's house with music. He leaves it through a window like a hunted man. And yet, even here, the shape of his heart remains the deeper point. David's story could easily be told as a rise in fame followed by palace intrigue. But the stronger truth is that his heart is being tested now in a new way. Success had not made him proud. Now danger will test whether injustice can make him hard. He is about to lose safety, home, and the ease of being openly honored. He is about to learn what it means to wait for God's promise while being treated like an enemy. This next season will be long and rough. It will take him into wilderness, Gabas, lies born of fear, loyal followers, songs of sorrow, and moments when he will have every chance to seize power with his own hands. Those tests are still ahead, for now the night holds him as he escapes. Jonathan remains in the house of his father, loving the friend he cannot fully protect. Michal stands in the shadow of the window she has just opened. Saul sits inside his own rage, more trapped by it than he can understand. And David runs into the dark, not away from God's purpose, but deeper into the severe path by which that purpose will be fulfilled. Night opened over David like a second country. He had left Saul's house in secrecy, slipping through a window, dropping into darkness, moving with the kind of careful urgency that does not allow much time for thought. But thought comes later. It always does. Once the body is moving, once the danger is behind you for a moment, the mind begins catching up, and then the ache of what has been lost starts to arrive. The palace where he had once played the harp was no longer a place of service. It had become a place of threat. The king he had honored wanted him dead. The songs of victory had turned into footsteps at the door. So David's next chapter begins in exile, though not yet the grand, lonely exile we might imagine from a distance. It begins with one flight after another, one hurried choice after another, one shelter becoming unsafe, then another. The path of the future king looks less like triumph and more like a man trying to survive until morning. He first made his way to the priests at Nob, to Ahimelech, and even here the strain of fear bends his conduct. David does not tell the whole truth. He claims he is on a secret mission for the king. The lie hangs quietly in the scene, and I think it is important not to smooth it away. David is not presented as flawless in these difficult moments. He is under pressure. He is afraid. He reaches for protection in a way that is understandable and still costly. That is part of why his story feels so human. Even a heart turned toward God can stumble in panic. Ahimelech receives him with concern. David is alone, hungry, visibly burdened by something he does not fully explain. The priest has no ordinary bread on hand, only the consecrated bread, the bread usually reserved for sacred use. Yet it is given to David in his need. It is a small scene on the surface, bread placed into hungry hands, but it carries the quiet tenderness of mercy in a dangerous time. A starving fugitive is fed from holy provision. He also receives something else there, something almost symbolic in its weight. The sword of Goliath, that old weapon, wrapped and kept behind the ephod, is brought out and placed before him. The giant who once fell in the valley is now present only through the sword David takes into the wilderness. It is a strange image. The memory of public triumph now becomes an object carried through private fear. David takes it because there is no other like it, and perhaps because when a life starts breaking open around you, the old signs of gods help become precious in new ways. But a shadow is already standing in the room. Doeg the Edomite is there, one of Saul's servants, and the story lets us feel his presence without needing to shout it. Some people in a scene seem to absorb more than they say, and Doeg is one of them. Hesses. He remembers. He will later report what happened, and what looks like a brief moment of aid will lead to terrible consequences. That is one of the hardest truths in David's wilderness years. His danger does not remain his alone. Others suffer because they helped him. From Nob David flees to Gath, which is almost unbelievable when you pause over it. He goes into Philistine territory, the land of enemies, the world associated with the very giant he killed. It is the kind of desperate move a man makes when the familiar places have become too dangerous to trust. Yet even there, fear follows him. The servants of Achish recognize him. "Is this not David?" they ask. "The king of the land, the one about whom songs were sung." His fame has outrun him. The victory that once raised him now puts him at risk in foreign territory. And so David does something strange and deeply revealing of his desperation. He pretends to be mad. He scratches at the doors. He lets saliva run down his beard. He lowers himself in the eyes of others so that they will no longer see him as dangerous. There is something almost painful in it. This man, once celebrated in Israel's songs, now surviving by making himself look broken in the court of his enemies. But wilderness years often strip dignity away before they give wisdom in return. David is learning that survival under God's providence does not always look noble in the moment. After that, he finds refuge in the cave of Adullam. Now, the wilderness takes on its real shape. Stone, shadow, hard ground, a life thinned down to essentials. Caves are strange places. They are shelter, but not comfort. They hold sound in odd ways. A cough carries. A whisper clings. Water drips somewhere in the dark as if time itself were counting slowly. The air can feel cool and stale at once. Light enters only in narrow ways, and the world beyond the entrance always seems both near and uncertain. Here David begins to gather people around him, though gather may sound too organized for what really happens. Men in distress come. Men in debt come. Men who are bitter in soul come. It is not exactly the polished beginning of a royal court. It is more like the making of a rough little nation out of the overlooked and burdened. I have always liked that detail. David does not begin ruling among the impressive. He begins among the weary. And yet, something important is happening in that cave. Leadership is being formed in hardship. David is no longer only tending sheep or serving a king. He is now holding together a fragile community of troubled men. He must feed them, guide them, calm them, and keep them moving. The field trained him in patience. The court trained him in watchfulness. The cave trains him in carrying other people's uncertainty along with his own. His family comes to him too, which adds both comfort and burden. Their presence means love remains. It also means his danger has become the danger of those connected to him. At one point, he places his parents under the protection of the king of Moab, a practical decision made out of care. This is what the wilderness does. It turns each day into a series of choices made under pressure. Each choice weighed not only for survival, but for the safety of others. Meanwhile, Saul grows harsher. The king who once listened to David's harp is now consumed by the hunt. And when he learns that the priests of Nob helped David, his rage spills outward with horrifying injustice. Ahimelech and the priests are accused, and when Saul's own servants refuse to carry out the killing, Doeg steps in and does it. The massacre at Nob is one of the darkest moments in this phase of the story. We do not need to linger on its violence to feel its sorrow. Innocent men die because they showed mercy to the wrong fugitive. Sacred space is stained by a king's paranoia. When news of it reaches David, the weight lands heavily on him. He knows that his presence there, and Doeg's witness to it, played a part in their deaths. There is no easy way to carry such knowledge. This is not guilt in the sense of murderous intent, but it is grief sharpened by involvement. David promises protection to Abiathar, the surviving son of Ahimelech, and in that promise you can hear both compassion and burden. The hunted man now shelters another survivor of Saul's destruction. The years that follow are made of movement, hiding, narrow escapes, and the long education of restraint. One of the most defining features of this season is that David receives not one, but two clear opportunities to kill Saul, and each time he refuses. The first happens in the cave at En-Gedi. Saul enters the cave to relieve himself, unaware that David and his men are hidden in the darkness farther inside. It is one of those moments that almost seems arranged too perfectly. The pursued man has his pursuer unguarded, vulnerable, within reach. David's men can hardly believe it. This, they whisper, is the day the Lord has handed your enemy over to you. It would have been so easy to justify violence in that moment. David had every earthly reason. Saul had hunted him unjustly. Saul had slaughtered priests. Saul would surely continue the pursuit if spared. Many people would have called it wisdom to strike. Some would have called it justice. Others would have called it destiny. David creeps forward in the cave and cuts off a corner of Saul's robe. Even that small act troubles him. This is one of the most revealing moments in the whole story. He does not kill Saul, and afterward his conscience is pierced even by the lesser insult of cutting the robe. Why? Because Saul is still the Lord's anointed. David understands something here that is easy to miss in our hunger for resolution. The promise of kingship does not give him the right to seize it by his own violence. He will not force what God has promised. He will not become king by staining his own soul. So, he restrains his men. He lets Saul leave the cave alive. Then he goes out and calls after him, showing the corner of the robe as proof. He could have killed him. He did not. He bows. He speaks with sorrow and dignity. He asks why the king listens to those who tell lies about him. He places the matter in God's hands. You can hear in this both courage and grief. David is not weak here. It takes greater strength not to strike when every argument around you says strike. This is exactly the kind of thing that helps explain why he is remembered as a man after God's own heart. His heart is not rushing towards self-advancement. It is bending itself under reverence for God even when that reverence costs him the cleaner, quicker ending he might want. Saul is moved for a moment. He weeps. He admits David's righteousness. He blesses him, in a way, even acknowledging that David will surely be king. Yet the peace does not last. Such moments with Saul are like brief clearings in a storm. They open, they soften, then they close again. The second opportunity comes later, in Saul's camp at night. David and Abishai slip down among the sleeping men. It is a scene full of stillness and danger. The camp lies under darkness. Spears are planted near the sleeping forms. Breathing rises and falls around them. Saul is there with his spear stuck in the ground by his head, a symbol of royal power resting beside a man utterly defenseless in sleep. Abishai whispers that this is the chance. One strike. No need for a second. Again, David refuses. Who can put out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? He says. The words ring with the same conviction as before, perhaps even deeper now that the wilderness has worn him thin. David takes only the spear and the water jar, signs that he had been there, signs of restraint rather than blood. Then from a distance he calls out, exposing the negligence of Saul's guards and proving once more that he spared the king's life. Twice David could have ended the story by force. Twice he leaves the ending to God. That does not make the waiting easy. Years in hiding are never easy. The Psalms born from this period carry fear, exhaustion, longing, and trust braided tightly together. David learns how to pray from within trouble, not just after it has passed. He learns how to speak honestly to God without turning away from Him. That may be the deepest formation of all in these years. The wilderness does not merely test David's endurance. It teaches his heart to keep returning. Eventually, Saul's pursuit comes to an end, not by David's hand, but in battle against the Philistines. The king falls on Mount Gilboa. Jonathan falls with him. The hunted years that shaped David are closing, though not with a simple joy. What comes next is not celebration first, but grief. Deep grief. The kind that reveals whether a man's heart has grown bitter or remained capable of honor. And David, for all he has suffered, will answer that question with tears rather than triumph. The news came to David from the battlefield like a wind carrying ash. Saul was dead. Jonathan was dead. Israel's army had been broken on Mount Gilboa. The long pursuit, the years of flight, the caves, the narrow escapes, the relentless tension of being hunted by the king, all of it had ended, but not in the way some might have expected. There is no image here of David smiling at last, no private satisfaction, no feeling that justice has finally made room for relief. Instead, the next movement in his story begins with grief. A young Amalekite arrives with torn clothes and dust on his head, the visible signs of someone bringing grave news. He tells David what has happened. He claims, perhaps truthfully, perhaps not, that he himself dealt the final blow to Saul at the king's request. It is a calculated story. He assumes David will reward the man who ended his enemy. After all, is this not what many rulers would have done? A brutal situation has solved itself. The obstacle is gone. The throne is nearer now than ever before. But the Amalekite has badly misread David's heart. David asks him how he was not afraid to lift his hand against the Lord's anointed. Then he orders that the man be struck down. It is a severe response, but unimportant one. David will not build his future on applause for violence against Saul, not even now. The same reverence that restrained him in the cave and the camp remains in place after Saul's death. He had refused to seize the kingdom by force, and he will also refuse to celebrate anyone who claims to have done it for him. Then David mourns. He weeps for Saul. He weeps for Jonathan. The men with him weep and fast as well. This is one of the most beautiful and searching things about David. Suffering has not turned him into a man unable to honor what was good. Saul had tried to kill him. Yes, Saul had made his life hard and bitter in many ways. Yet David does not reduce him to that. He remembers the king's strength, the king's victories, the king's former dignity. He grieves the fall of Israel. He grieves the loss of the one who once stood at the head of the people. And he grieves Jonathan with a tenderness that seems to deepen the whole air around the story. The lament David sings over Saul and Jonathan is not merely public duty. It is full of real sorrow. "How the mighty have fallen," he says, and the line feels like a bell tolling over mountain ridges. He remembers Saul's swiftness and strength. He calls on the daughters of Israel to weep. And when he speaks of Jonathan, the grief turns especially intimate. The friend who loved him without envy, the friend who recognized him without resentment, the friend whose father could not stop seeing him as a threat, that friend is gone. I think it is worth lingering here, because this lament shows exactly the kind of heart the whole title points us toward. David is not great because he wins. He is great because even in the hour when others might have chosen revenge or self-congratulation, he chooses sorrow, honor, and love. He does not let pain make him small. Only after mourning does he ask what to do next. That detail matters. David inquires of the Lord, "Shall I go up into one of the towns of Judah?" The answer comes, "Go up," and then more specifically, to Hebron. This becomes one of the clear rhythms of his life. Again and again, when he is at his best, David does not force the next step. He seeks it. This does not mean he never acts boldly, because he certainly does, but his boldness is strongest when it grows out of dependence on God rather than impatience. So David goes to Hebron, bringing his men and their households with him. There, in the hill country of Judah, he is anointed king over the house of Judah. It is a significant moment, but not the final one. The promise begins opening publicly now. Yet even here, the path remains slower and more complicated than many stories would allow. David does not step immediately onto a fully united throne. He becomes king in part before he becomes king in full. The long patience of his life continues. Meanwhile, the rest of Israel does not simply fall into line. Abner, commander of Saul's army, sets up Ishbosheth, Saul's son, as king over the other tribes. And so the kingdom enters a period of division and civil struggle. Not a glorious beginning, but a painful one. The war between the house of Saul and the house of David lasts a long time. That phrase says much with few words. A long time. Delay again. Friction again. Waiting again. David grows stronger. The house of Saul grows weaker. Yet the details of this period are not neat. They are full of rivalry, grief, and bloodshed that David does not always control. Abner eventually quarrels with Ishbosheth and decides to bring the northern tribes over to David. He comes to Hebron and is received peacefully. It seems for a moment that at last unity may arrive through negotiation rather than prolonged conflict. But then Joab intervenes. Joab, David's commander, is a complicated and dangerous presence in the story. Capable, loyal in some ways, but also fierce, vengeful, and very willing to act on his own harsh instincts. He cannot forgive Abner for the death of his brother in battle, and so he lures Abner aside and kills him. This creates a serious problem for David. Abner had come in peace. If David's rise is now associated with treacherous murder, then the moral shape of his kingship will be damaged before the throne is even secure. So David responds publicly and with forceful sorrow. He declares himself innocent of Abner's blood. He curses the guilt back onto Joab's house. He mourns Abner openly, walking behind the bier, weeping at the grave, fasting until evening. Again, the pattern holds. David does not hide behind expedience. He does not shrug and say the killing benefited him politically. So perhaps it is best left alone. He grieves. He distances himself from unjust violence, even when it is committed by his own side. The people notice this. They see that David is not rejoicing in murders done for his advantage. Soon another opportunity arrives to test that same principle. Ishbosheth is assassinated by two of his own captains while lying on his bed in the heat of the day. They cut off his head and bring it to David in Hebron, expecting approval. It is the same terrible misreading seen earlier in the Amalekite. They think the rising king will welcome those who clear his path through blood. He does not. David reminds them of the Amalekite who claimed to have killed Saul and how that man was repaid. Then he condemns these captains for murdering an innocent man in his own house. He orders their execution. Their bodies are displayed as a warning, while Ishbosheth's head is buried honorably in Abner's tomb. There is a steadiness in these scenes that reveals something crucial about David's heart. He is not merely waiting for power. He is waiting in a certain way. He will not take the throne as a trophy passed to him by opportunists with bloody hands. He insists, however imperfectly in the larger story, that his kingship must not be founded on treachery disguised as service. Finally, with Saul gone, Jonathan gone, Abner gone, and Ishbosheth gone, the elders of all the tribes come to David at Hebron. The mood of that gathering must have been solemn and heavy with history. They remind David that even in the days of Saul, he was the one who led Israel out and back in battle. They recall the word of the Lord that he would shepherd the people and become ruler over Israel. That old image returns. Shepherd. It is a lovely continuity. Even now, at the edge of kingship, David is described in terms of care, guidance, and responsibility before domination. The elders make a covenant with him before the Lord, and they anoint David king over Israel. At last, the hidden oil in Jesse's house has become public reality for the whole nation. But even in this fulfillment, the story remains marked by the qualities that have shaped it from the beginning. David arrives here through patience rather than seizure, through lament rather than revenge, through consultation with God rather than self-directed ambition. He has been shepherd, musician, giant slayer, friend, fugitive, and mourner before becoming king of all Israel. Perhaps that is why the title still fits him so well. A man after God's own heart is not a man without sorrow, delay, or conflict. He is a man whose life, again and again, bends back toward reverence, prayer, and moral restraint even when the path is steep. Now that the kingdom is united under him, a new chapter is ready to open. Jerusalem waits. Victories wait. The ark waits. The highest splendor of David's reign is near. So too, though still hidden from sight, are the sins and griefs that will test everything he has built. For the moment, however, the long wandering has ended in Hebron, and David stands at last where promise and history meet. With the tribes finally gathered under one crown, David turned from wandering toward building, and that shift carried its own strange tenderness. For years his life had been made of movement, pursuit, hiding, lament, and waiting. He had learned how to sleep in caves, how to listen for danger in the dark, how to pray with dust on his face and uncertainty in his chest. Now, at last, the Lord had given him a kingdom joined together, not perfectly, not effortlessly, but truly enough that he could begin asking a different kind of question. Not how do I survive until dawn, but where will the heart of this people beat? He chose Jerusalem. That choice can sound simple when told quickly, but it deserves to be walked through slowly. Jerusalem was not yet the city later generations would imagine when they heard its name. It was not yet wrapped in all the layers of memory, worship, longing, and sorrow it would one day hold. At that moment, it was a stronghold, an old place of stone and steep approaches, held by the Jebusites, a city that seemed content to outlast other people's ambitions. There are cities that look as though they belong to history. Jerusalem already had that quality, even before David made it his own. The Jebusites mocked him. They believed the city could not be taken. Their confidence had the dusty arrogance of people who have watched would-be conquerors stare up at their walls and go away, disappointed. Yet David did not go away. The stronghold fell, and with its fall, something more than a military objective was gained. A center had been found, a place that sat between north and south, a city that did not belong too strongly to one tribe over another, a place that could become the shared heart of the nation rather than a tribal possession held in suspicion by the rest. Stone by stone, gate by gate, street by street, Jerusalem began to gather meaning. David built around it. He strengthened it. He made it the city of David, but that phrase would eventually mean more than a royal address. It would mean memory, covenant, kingship, song, and the hush that comes over a people when a place begins to feel appointed. I have always found that part of the story moving, because David does not merely inherit a center. He helps create one. A nation that had long known fragmentation and rivalry now had a city to look toward. The king who once led sheep over open hills now began shaping a capital in stone. Still, a crown does not remove danger. It only changes its shape. The Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over all Israel, and they came looking for him. Old enemies do not disappear because a story has entered its more triumphant chapter. Very often they return precisely because the triumph is beginning to take form. That is what happens here. And in these moments, with power now secure enough to test him, David shows one of the habits that marks his better years. He asks the Lord what to do. That detail is easy to pass over because it sounds simple. but it is one of the clearest windows into his heart. He does not move as though kingship itself has made him wise. He does not assume that because he has won before, he knows automatically how every new battle must be fought. He inquires, "Shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you give them into my hand?" The answer comes, and David goes. Victory follows. Then the Philistines come again. Once more he asks, and this time the instruction is different. He is told not to attack in the same way, but to circle around, to wait for the sound in the tops of the balsam trees, to move when the sign is given. There is something beautifully calming in that rhythm. Ask, listen, wait, move. Ask, listen, wait, move. It is almost like breathing. It is certainly like trust. This matters because David is now in the dangerous territory of success. Success can make a person numb to dependence. It can turn earlier prayer into later habitlessness. Yet at this stage, he still leans toward God. That is one of the reasons he is remembered as a man after God's own heart. Not because he always got everything right, because he plainly did not, but because in his best seasons he kept refusing to act as though God were unnecessary once the throne had finally arrived. The victories over the Philistines strengthened Israel and stabilized the kingdom. The borders were safer. The threat that had once produced Goliath and long humiliation was pushed back. But David was not satisfied with military security alone. His heart was moving towards something deeper, something lit by reverence rather than by strategy. He wanted the Ark of the Covenant in Jerusalem. That desire says much about the kind of king he wished to be. He could have settled for a capital, an army, a palace, and the visible signs of royal success. He could have become merely a political ruler, content with tribute, walls, and loyalty. Instead, he wanted the presence of God near the center of national life. He wanted the city of government to become also a city of worship. He wanted the place of the throne to be joined to the place of the ark. The ark had long stood as a sign of covenant and holy nearness. It was no ordinary religious object, and the story never lets us think of it that way. Around it hung memory, warning, reverence, and the knowledge that God's presence was not something to be managed casually. Yet joy often runs ahead of caution in human hearts, and the first attempt to bring the ark to Jerusalem shows exactly that. The procession began with celebration. Music sounded. Instruments were played. There was movement, anticipation, a kind of public gladness that must have felt almost like a festival flowing across the land. One can imagine the dust rising under many feet, the light resting on wood and cloth, the sound of voices joining the instruments in waves of joy. After so many hard years, what could be more fitting than to welcome the ark toward the king's city with music and delight? Then the oxen stumbled. The moment turns in an instant. Uzzah reached out his hand to steady the ark, and he died there beside it. The joy of the procession collapsed into stillness. A moment before, there had been sound, movement, celebration. Now there was fear. Cold fear. The kind that enters a crowd and silences each person separately, until everyone is standing in the same shocked hush. David was shaken, even troubled in spirit. The story lets us feel that disturbance without dressing it up. He is angry and afraid. He names the place out of that rupture. "How can the ark of the Lord come to me?" he asks. That question is not merely practical. It is the question of a man realizing that desire for God's presence, though good, is not the same thing as approaching that presence rightly. I think this moment matters enormously for understanding David. A lesser heart might have turned bitter. Another man might have said, "Enough then. Let the ark remain where it is, if holiness comes with such danger." But David does not abandon reverence. He pauses. He leaves the ark for a time in the house of Obed-Edom. He learns. He allows the shock to teach him. That too is a mark of his better self. He can be corrected, even painfully, without hardening into resentment against God. 3 months pass. There is a softness in that delay. Time enough for the first violence of the moment to settle into reflection. Time enough for word to spread that blessing rests on the house where the ark now remains. Time enough for David to gather himself again, not with careless enthusiasm this time, but with reverent attention. Then the second attempt begins. Now the ark is carried according to the command that should have guided the first procession. Sacrifice accompanies the movement. Joy returns, but it is a better joy, chastened, instructed, joined to trembling. I have always thought some of the most beautiful worship in life is not the easy kind, but the kind that has passed through correction and returned purified. That is what this procession feels like. The ark comes toward Jerusalem. Trumpets sound. Voices rise. Steps move in measured rhythm. Dust lifts beneath feet. Linen garments shift in the air. The city receives the procession, and David dances before the Lord with all his might. That image has lasted because it reveals something at once regal and childlike. David is king, and yet he is not protecting himself with kingly distance. He is not curating dignity the way proud rulers often do. He is rejoicing. He is bodily, openly, unapologetically glad before God. His movement seems almost to say that there are moments when gratitude becomes too large to remain only inside the chest. Michal, the daughter of Saul, sees him and despises him in her heart. To her, the king's behavior looks improper, beneath dignity, too loose for the ruler of Israel. One can almost feel the old house of Saul in that reaction. The concern for image, for posture, for the visible shape of royal honor. But David answers from another center entirely. He says that he danced before the Lord who chose him above her father and his house, and that he would make himself even more contemptible in his own eyes if that is what rejoicing before God required. It is a striking answer. Better to be small before God than polished before people. Better to lose social grandeur than worship with a guarded soul. That, again, is why the title fits him. A man after God's own heart is not one who merely performs devotion when it flatters him. It is one whose heart is willing to be humbled by joy. With the ark established in Jerusalem, the city became not only a political center, but a spiritual one. The king, the people, the sacred sign of covenant, all now shared the same symbolic space. David had done what he longed to do. Yet his desire did not stop there. Once settled in his palace of cedar, he looked around and felt the tension. He lived in a house Edom, while the ark of God remained under tent cloth. The imbalance troubled him. So he spoke to Nathan of his desire to build a permanent house for the Lord. At first, Nathan seems ready to affirm the plan. It sounds right. It sounds noble. But the word of the Lord comes that night and redirects everything. David is not to build the house. He is not the one appointed for that labor. The answer could have landed as disappointment, and surely some part of it did. Yet what follows is so large that it turns the refusal into promise. Through Nathan, God speaks to David in language full of reversal and grace. Are you the one to build me a house? I have not dwelt in a house since I brought Israel up from Egypt. Then the word turns, and suddenly the house in view is not a temple of cedar, but a dynasty, a lineage, an enduring promise. The Lord himself will make David a house. One can imagine the room growing very still as those words are heard. The shepherd from Bethlehem, the youngest son left out in the field, the harp player in a troubled court, the fugitive in caves, the mourner in Hebron, the dancer before the ark, is now being told that his line will continue, that his offspring will follow him, that his kingdom will be established, that there is a future being built by God beyond the reach of his own immediate plans. The promise stretches beyond his life. It reaches into generations. It becomes one of the great pillars of Israel's hope. This is the high, bright summit of David's story. Jerusalem has been taken. The kingdom has been strengthened. The ark has been brought home. Worship has filled the city, and now covenant promise settles over his house like evening light across stone. David's response is one of the loveliest prayers in Scripture. He goes in and sits before the Lord. The image itself is intimate and quiet. Not a public parade, not a military review, not the outward performance of kingship, but a man seated before God with wonder in him. And he says, "Who am I, O Lord God, and what is my house, that you have brought me thus far?" That question contains so much: gratitude, humility, memory, a sense of the long road behind him and the mercy that has carried him over it. He does not answer the promise with entitlement. He does not behave as though the covenant simply confirms what he always knew he deserved. He is astonished, rightly astonished. I have always found that the most compelling thing about David in his best moments is precisely this capacity for astonishment. He knows that what he has been given is gift. He knows where he came from. He knows the fields, the caves, the years of waiting, the near deaths, the griefs. So when promise comes, it does not meet a closed hand. It meets a heart still able to wonder. The kingdom continued to flourish in those years. Victories widened Israel's influence. Wealth entered the royal house. Tribute was brought. Enemies were subdued. Yet alongside the military and political success, David still showed signs of covenant loyalty and personal kindness. He remembered Jonathan. He asked whether anyone remained of Saul's house to whom he could show kindness for Jonathan's sake. That question leads him to Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, lame in his feet, living away from the center of power. David brings him in, restores land to him, and gives him a place at the king's table. That scene has always felt quietly beautiful to me. A table in Jerusalem, a son of the old royal house. The memory of friendship kept alive not by sentiment alone, but by mercy. It shows that in his strength, David had not entirely lost tenderness. Memory and gratitude still moved in him. These were the high years. The years when the city was growing. The ark had arrived. The covenant had been spoken. The enemies were subdued, and the king seemed settled in both power and worship. If one were telling the story only as a rise, one could almost end here. The shepherd has become the beloved king. God has blessed him. The people are united. The capital stands. The future appears radiant. But human souls are more fragile than their high points suggest. The very brightness of this season gives the next chapter its ache. For now, though, let the city remain in this glow a little longer. Let the evening settle over Jerusalem with the ark resting in its place and the covenant still warm in David's heart. Let the king sit before the Lord and remember how far he has been brought. Let the trumpets fade into the night air. Let the stones of the city hold the last of the day's warmth. The summit has been reached, and because it has been reached, the fall that follows will matter all the more. The darkest wound in David's story came not from a giant, not from Saul, not from the Philistines, and not from any distant enemy looking toward Jerusalem with sharpened ambition. It came from within the walls he had built, within the ease he had come to inhabit, and within his own heart. That is often how the deepest collapses begin. Not with the obvious threat, but with the inward loosening that comes after long success. In the spring, at the time when kings go out to war, David remained in Jerusalem. The line is quiet, but it opens an abyss. The armies are away. The business of battle has been delegated. The city is under evening light. The king rises from his bed and walks on the roof of the palace. There is air enough, silence enough, distance enough for thought to drift. He looks out and sees Bathsheba bathing. The turn that follows is swift, and that swiftness is part of what makes it so chilling. He asks about her. He is told she is Bathsheba, wife of Uriah the Hittite. The knowledge should have been enough. Instead he sends. He takes. Desire becomes action, and action becomes sin. The man who once asked what the Lord desired now moves according to appetite without reverence. The man who would not seize the throne by force now seizes what is not his under the shelter of power. When Bathsheba sends word that she is pregnant, fear enters the story in a new form. David tries to cover what he has done. He calls Uriah back from the field, hoping that the soldier will go down to his house, sleep with his wife, and make the truth appear simpler than it is. But Uriah will not do it. He refuses the comfort of home while the ark, Israel, and Judah remain in tents, and while his fellow soldiers are in the open field. That refusal is one of the sharpest ironies in the whole story. Uriah, the man being wronged, stands before David with the integrity David himself has abandoned. He speaks with loyalty, duty, and self-restraint. The king, meanwhile, is trying to use his faithfulness to conceal betrayal. A noble man becomes the mirror in which David's failure looks even darker. When the first plan fails, David moves further into sin. Orders are written and sent by Uriah's own hand back to Joab. Put him in the fiercest fighting, then draw back from him so that he may be struck down. The language of war is allowed to hide the intention, but the intention is there. Uriah ds. Bathsheba mourns. David brings her into his house, and she becomes his wife. If the story ended at public appearances, he might have imagined the matter secured. The city still stands. The throne still holds. The scandal is buried beneath royal arrangements. But the story does not end at appearances. It tells us, with calm and devastating clarity, that what David had done displeased the Lord. Then Nathan comes. The prophet does not begin with accusation in direct form. He begins with a story, because stories can enter where defenses are strongest. A rich man with many flocks takes the one little ewe lamb belonging to a poor man. David hears the injustice and burns with anger. The man deserves judgment. He deserves to restore what he has taken. And Nathan says, "You are the man." There are sentences that do not merely correct a person, but break the air open around him. This is one of them. In that moment, the king's layers of concealment are stripped away. The gifts God gave him are set beside his ingratitude. The protection he received is set beside the harm he has done. The mercy that shaped his life is set beside the hardness he has shown. Judgment is pronounced. The sword will not depart from his house. The child born from this union will die. And David says, "I have sinned against the Lord." That confession matters. It does not solve the consequences. It does not erase the dead. It does not mend Bathsheba's grief or call Uriah back from the field. But it matters, because here again we see the strange central truth of David's life. When fully confronted, he returns. He does not build a philosophy around his failure. He does not explain it away. He does not strike Nathan down or hide behind royal dignity. He confesses. Yet forgiveness is not the same as freedom from consequence, and the story does not let us forget that. The child grows ill. David fasts, lies on the ground, and pleads with God. One can almost feel the palace around him during those days. Servants whispering, doors closing softly, the king refusing food, time stretching under dread. On the 7th day, the child dies. The servants are afraid to tell him, but when David understands, he rises. He washes. He anoints himself. He changes his clothes. Then he goes into the house of the Lord and worships. I do not think that scene is meant to feel easy. It is not ease. It is surrender. It is the baffled, bruised movement of a man who cannot control what has been lost and can only place himself again before God. Some people would call that contradictory. I think it is painfully human. Grief and worship often live closer together than we expect. In time, Bathsheba bears another son, Solomon, and the story does not deny that mercy still exists. Yet Nathan's word about the sword in David's house begins unfolding with terrible force. Amnon, David's son, violates his half-sister, Tamar. The crime is not graphic in the telling here, but its ruin spreads through the whole household like smoke. Tamar is devastated. Absalom, her brother, carries the wound in silence for a time, and then takes revenge by arranging Amnon's death. From there, estrangement deepens, and the king's family becomes the site of grief, anger, pride, and unresolved love. Absalom is one of the saddest figures in David's life because he is both son and danger, beauty and fracture, longing and rebellion all at once. He returns, but not cleanly. Time passes. Resentment repens. He begins to steal the hearts of the people by standing at the gate, listening to their complaints, speaking to them with the charm of a man who knows how to look like justice while feeding ambition underneath. Slowly, gently, skillfully, he gathers affection away from his father. When the conspiracy is strong enough, the report reaches David. Absalom has been proclaimed king. Hearts are turning. Jerusalem is no longer safe. So David flees the city he once captured. That reversal is almost unbearable if you remember the triumph of the earlier years. The same Jerusalem that received the ark with trumpet and song now watches the king leave barefoot and weeping. He ascends the Mount of Olives with his head covered, and those with him cover their heads and weep as they go. The city is behind him. The air is thick with sorrow. The king is not robed in public splendor here. He is stripped down into grief. You know that feeling when consequence is no longer an idea but a road under your feet. That is this moment. Every step out of Jerusalem carries both political danger and moral memory. David is not suffering here only because a son has turned against him. He is suffering inside the long echo of his own earlier sin. The household has become a place of judgment. Yet even in this brokenness, the old shape of his heart has not vanished. When Shimei curses him, throws stones, and calls him a man of blood, David's followers want to silence the insult at once. David restrains them. "Leave him," he says in effect. "Perhaps the Lord has told him to curse. Perhaps the Lord will look on my affliction." That is not weakness. It is a chastened humility. He no longer rushes so quickly to defend his own dignity. He leaves room for God, even in humiliation. The conflict with Absalom moves toward its end, and despite David's command to deal gently with the young man, Absalom is killed. When the news reaches him, David's grief spills out with unforgettable force. "O mi son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you?" The cry is too large for political categories. This is not only the death of a rebel, it is the death of a beloved son, a son who became enemy, a son who carried both guilt and lost possibility. David's voice breaks under the weight of love that cannot undo what has happened. The kingdom survives, but it does not emerge untouched. Something in David's house remains permanently scarred. This is the hard wisdom of the story. Repentance is real. Forgiveness is real, but human actions can still send damage forward through years in ways that no confession can simply erase. Later, near the end of his reign, David commits another grave error. He orders a census of the fighting men, counting the strength of the nation in a way that reveals misplaced trust. Numbers can feel comforting to rulers. They create the illusion that power is measurable, secure, and finally resting in visible resources. Yet this act is not presented as prudent administration. It is presented as sin, and David knows it almost as soon as it is done. His conscience strikes him. He confesses again, "I have sinned greatly in what I have done." Judgment follows in the form of plague, and the land suffers. At last mercy comes through sacrifice at the threshing floor of Araunah. David buys the site rather than taking it for free. He builds an altar. He offers burnt offerings and peace offerings. The plague is halted. Even here, amid judgment, providence is quietly at work. That place becomes associated with the future temple. It is remarkable how often in Scripture the site of sorrow becomes, by God's mysterious work, a site of future worship. David could not erase what had happened, but he could bow, sacrifice, and prepare the ground for what would outlast him. As age settles over him, his attention turns more steadily toward the temple he himself will never build. God had already told him that the work would belong to another, to Solomon. David accepts that boundary, and his acceptance becomes a final form of devotion. He gathers gold, silver, bronze, iron, cedar, and stone in staggering abundance. He organizes Levites, priests, singers, musicians, and gatekeepers. He arranges not only materials but order, not only wealth but worship. There is something deeply moving in old age, spent preparing for a holy work another person will complete. David had wanted to build the house himself. In the end, he becomes the one who makes ready what he will not personally finish. That is humility. Mature humility. The kind that has given up needing to be the final visible hero of every good thing. Then the question of succession rises urgently. Adonijah exalts himself, assuming the throne can be reached by confidence and timing. But Bathsheba and Nathan bring the matter before David, and the old king acts. He orders that Solomon ride on his own mule. Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet are to anoint him. Trumpets sound. The people rejoice. Solomon is established. The scene quietly echoes the beginning of David's own life. Once he had been the chosen son, anointed in a surprising moment, while others did not yet understand. Now, near death, he ensures that the chosen successor is publicly confirmed in peace rather than chaos. There is a kind of tenderness in that continuity. One anointed king making way for the next. David's final counsel to Solomon is weighty because it comes from lived experience rather than abstract principle. Be strong. Walk in the ways of the Lord. Keep his statutes, commandments, and testimonies. He knows what happens when a king obeys. He also knows what happens when a king turns aside. His words carry both hope and warning. Then, after a life too full for any neat summary, David Theus. He had reigned 40 years, 7 in Hebron and 33 in Jerusalem. He was buried in the city of David. Yet burial did not close the reach of his story. His legacy moved outward in many directions at once. He remained the measure against which later kings were judged. His psalms, or the Psalms bound to his name, continued to give voice to prayer, praise, fear, guilt, joy, and repentance. His covenant became central to Israel's hope, reaching forward toward the expectation of a greater son of David whose kingdom would not end. So why is he remembered as a man after God's own heart? Not because he was spotless. He was not. Not because he escaped consequences. He did not. Not because greatness protected him from moral collapse. It did not. He is remembered that way because the deepest line of his life was return. He asked the Lord. He praised the Lord. He confessed to the Lord. He sat in wonder before the Lord. He fled in tears and still turned toward the Lord. Even after terrible sin, even after bitter grief, even after the long unravelings within his own house, his heart did not make peace with distance from God. It bent back. Again and again it bent back. That is why his story endures. It is not the story of a hero too polished to recognize. It is the story of a real soul carried through calling, failure, mercy, kingship, music, blood, prayer, covenant, and sorrow. A shepherd becomes a king. A king becomes a mourner. A mourner becomes a singer. A sinner becomes a penitent. And through all of it, the heart at the center remains strangely alive to God. The fire is lower now. The city is quiet. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, the night air moves over stone. Somewhere, a harp string has long since gone still. Somewhere, a psalm is being remembered in a voice softer than the one that first sang it. The old king has gone to his rest, but the question his life leaves behind remains gentle and searching. Not whether greatness can be flawless, because it cannot, but whether a heart can keep returning after it has fallen, and whether mercy can hold such a life without lying about its wounds. David's story answers yes, though never cheaply, never lightly, never without tears. And now the room has grown still enough for the last thought to settle. The shepherd, the king, the sinner, the worshipper, the father, the put, the man who rose high and fell hard and still kept turning toward God, has faded into the hush of memory. Good night.